The moment I realized they had been taking advantage of me, it did not feel dramatic. There was no screaming match, no shattered glass, no single scene that made the whole truth obvious in 1 second. It was quieter than that. A detail that did not make sense. A document I was never supposed to notice. A conversation that sounded harmless until I replayed it later and understood what had really been happening. By then, the damage had already been done, and the worst part was not that strangers used me. It was that the people doing it were family. People who smiled at me at dinners. People who called me loyal, dependable, and generous while quietly building something much bigger on top of my trust. Stories like this are why people listen to exposed stories media. Not because financial collapse is entertaining. Because behind almost every collapse, there is a private period where truth is being ignored on purpose. And the same arrogance that makes people comfortable using someone often becomes the thing that destroys everything they built. My family had money. Not old money. Not the kind that came with legacy buildings or generations of private schools. The kind of money that comes after one good business decision becomes 3, and then someone in the family starts believing that success means they understand everything. That person was my Aunt Linda. She was my mother's older sister, and for as long as I can remember, she was the one everyone described as smart with money. She invested early in the right places. She married a man who understood commercial real estate. She learned how to speak about assets, leverage, structure, and tax positioning in a tone that made everyone else in the family feel either impressed or slightly ashamed of not understanding more. Her husband, Greg, was quieter. He rarely dominated a room, but he did not have to. Linda spoke enough for both of them. Together, they built what people in our family started calling, only half-jokingly, the empire. That phrase mattered more than anyone realized. Because once a family starts describing its own financial success in those terms, morality begins to fade around the edges. Success stops being something people do and becomes something people feel entitled to protect at any cost. I was younger than Linda by almost 15 years. That meant I grew up watching her from a distance while she moved through adulthood like someone who had already figured out a system no one else fully understood. By the time I was in my 20s, she owned part of a shopping center, several residential buildings, and interests in 2 development entities with names that sounded professional enough to shut down follow-up questions. She also knew how to make other people feel included. That was her real talent. Not just making money. Making people feel that proximity to her success was a privilege. My mother admired her. My father distrusted her a little, though he rarely said so directly. He used to say Linda never gave anything away without first deciding what it would buy her later. At the time, I thought he was being cynical. Now I know he was being accurate. I was a financial analyst by then. Not wealthy, not particularly flashy, but disciplined. I understood reporting, audit structure, and how to read between the lines of polished investment language. That was what made me useful to Linda. It started innocently enough. She called one afternoon and said she needed a fresh set of eyes on some internal reporting because her team was moving too fast and she trusted me more than outside consultants. That part flattered me. Family approval is powerful even when you are old enough to know better. I said yes. At first, the work seemed straightforward. Review distribution timing. Reconcile property-level statements. Help identify where certain operating costs were being grouped too broadly in quarterly summaries. Nothing illegal. Nothing explosive. Just the kind of messy internal detail successful people often want cleaned up before presenting confidence to lenders and partners. Linda thanked me repeatedly. She called me sharp. She said I had the kind of mind investors trust. She told my mother I was a real asset to the family, which, looking back, was one of the most revealing phrases she ever used. An asset. Not nephew. Not family. Asset. For the first few months, I thought I was helping temporarily. Then the requests multiplied. A quick review became recurring support. A recurring support role became regular weekend work. Soon I was reviewing internal financial packets before lender meetings, helping reorganize reporting language for investor updates, and quietly correcting inconsistencies across entities that should have been handled by paid professionals. I asked once whether I should formalize the role. Linda smiled and said involving paperwork would only complicate the flexibility that made me so helpful. She said family should be able to help family without turning every act into a contract. That sentence sounds warm. It is not. That sentence is how people get free labor from someone whose loyalty they plan to monetize. I still did not fully see it then, because the environment around Linda and Greg made everything feel larger than ordinary life. Meetings in glass offices. Dinners where people spoke about acquisitions like weather systems. Conversations about debt in the same tone ordinary families use to discuss vacation timing. If you stand near enough to money, you start thinking sophistication must mean integrity. That illusion is one of the most expensive mistakes people make. The first thing that bothered me was not a missing payment or falsified number. It was language. Specific phrases kept appearing in draft reports that did not match the underlying mechanics I was reviewing. Stabilized income when occupancy was still in flux. Temporary timing distortion where the issue was actually recurring cash strain. Aligned asset performance when certain buildings were clearly subsidizing the weaker ones. I flagged the language privately. Linda always had an answer. She said sophisticated finance required presenting the bigger picture, not getting lost in short-term noise. Greg said lenders care about trajectory more than isolated quarter-to-quarter friction. Their outside advisor, a man named Howard with perfect suits and polished teeth, called my concerns technically correct but strategically immature. That phrase stayed with me. Strategically immature. It was the first moment I understood that in their world, truth was not something you honored automatically. It was something you managed, sequenced, and softened until other people were ready to hear the version of it that still served your position. I should have walked away then. Instead, I stayed, because some part of me still believed I was helping keep things honest from the inside. I told myself if I stopped looking, they would only replace me with someone less careful. That is how exploitation survives. It recruits your conscience into protecting the arrangement. The turning point came at a family gathering. Not a board meeting. Not a lender call. A birthday dinner for my grandmother at a private room in a restaurant downtown. Most of the family was there. Linda and Greg arrived late, dressed like they had come from something more important and were doing us a favor by stopping in. That alone set the tone. People always gathered around them, not only because they had money, because they had the kind of financial success ordinary relatives like to stand near, as if proximity might feel educational or contagious. My mother introduced me to one of Greg's investors that night and said I had been helping with some of the numbers. I would have preferred she not say anything, but before I could redirect the conversation, Linda laughed and said, "He's our unofficial cleanup crew. He panics first so the rest of us can make money in peace." The room laughed. Not viciously. Not yet. The kind of laughter people use when wealth gives someone the right to turn another person into part of the entertainment. I smiled once because public humiliation always takes a second to register. Then Howard, the advisor, added, "Every empire needs one person terrified of footnotes." More laughter. Louder this time. Because now the joke had shape. I was not the careful analyst helping protect the family from exposure. I was the anxious one, the small-minded one, the one too cautious to understand how serious players operate. Greg raised his glass and said, "That's why we let him inspect things after the real decisions are made." That line hit harder than anything else, because it wasn't just mocking. It was a confession buried inside humor. after the real decisions are made. I sat there with heat climbing into my face while people who knew nothing about the actual work I had done laughed at a version of me Linda had built for the room. A version that made her look bold, Greg look decisive, and my caution look childish. My father didn't laugh. That mattered. He looked at me once across the table, and I could tell he understood something had gone too far. But he did nothing. That mattered too, because humiliation becomes social fact when the people who know better still choose not to interrupt it. I left early. No speech. No confrontation. Just a quiet excuse about an early morning. In the parking garage, I sat in my car for almost 15 minutes, replaying the exact wording of everything they said. By the time I got home, one sentence had started repeating in my mind. He panics first so the rest of us can make money in peace. That was not a joke. That was a summary of the role they had assigned me. I reopened the files the next morning with different eyes. Not as a helpful relative. Not as someone trying to keep things clean enough from the inside. As someone finally willing to ask a harder question. Was I helping them stay honest? Or was I helping them look honest while they built something more dangerous than anyone in the family understood? The answer came faster than I expected. Once I stopped reading the reports as a cooperative insider, the pattern changed immediately. The numbers themselves did not change. My perspective did, and that made the structure visible in a way it had never been before. The first issue was distribution timing. Certain property entities were sending cash upward in ways that made the holding group look stronger than it was, while weaker assets were being masked through internal support that was never described clearly in lender-facing summaries. That by itself was not always unlawful, but it was far less stable than the language suggested. Then I saw the refinanced debt layering. 2 projects Linda kept describing as performing beautifully were only presenting well because one of them had been effectively propped up through a complicated timing structure that relied on delayed vendor payments, favorable internal classifications, and assumptions about occupancy that had not yet materialized. Again, not a simple smoking gun, something worse. A story engineered to survive long enough to attract confidence. That is when I started reviewing prior versions of the reports I had corrected. What I found changed everything. Edits I had made for accuracy had later been softened. Certain risk notes had been moved lower. Language I thought I was tightening had been written into something more polished, less specific, and more useful to people selling stability. My work had not been used to keep the truth intact. It had been used to give the illusion of rigor. That realization was the real betrayal. Not that they mocked me at dinner. That they had used my credibility, my corrections, and my care to strengthen a narrative they never intended to let remain fully honest. I printed 3 different versions of one quarterly packet and laid them side by side across my kitchen table. Eternal draft. My corrected review. Lender-facing final. The differences were subtle enough that most outsiders would never notice them. That is why this kind of thing survives. The truth is not usually deleted. It is thinned, relocated, softened, and reframed until it still technically exists but no longer threatens momentum. I called Linda that afternoon. I asked her why certain occupancy assumptions remained classified as stabilized when the supporting tenant improvements were still unresolved and part of the cash coverage depended on interentity movement she had never properly disclosed. There was a pause. Then she laughed softly and asked if I was really going to become doctrinaire now after being so useful for so long. That sentence told me everything. Useful. Not respected. Useful. I pressed harder. I asked whether Howard and Greg understood how much of the lender narrative depended on timing rather than actual resilience. She said something I will never forget. She said, "Everyone serious understands timing. You're the only one treating it like morality." That was the moment I knew I had been standing inside a system where ethical discomfort was considered amateurism. I did not threaten her. Not yet. I simply told her I would no longer review or correct anything unless my role, scope, and authority were formally documented. She grew cold immediately. She said formalizing anything now would only create unnecessary visibility. Another revealing phrase. Visibility, because what they had built was not designed to survive clarity. That evening, Greg called instead. His voice was calmer than Linda's, which somehow made it worse. He said emotions were clouding my judgment after an awkward family dinner. He said I was taking things personally that were meant socially. Then he said the sentence that ended any last loyalty I felt toward them. He said, "You've been very helpful, but let's not confuse support work with strategic standing." Support work. There it was. I had spent more than a year helping reconcile, repair, and clarify the exact numbers they were using to project sophistication, and when I asked for honesty, he reduced all of it to support work. Not because that was accurate, because minimizing my role made it easier to dismiss my warning. 2 days later, the first visible crack appeared outside our family. One of Linda's lenders issued a follow-up documentation request tied to a property group she had been using as a showcase of stable income. That request alone did not mean disaster, but it meant someone outside the room had started seeing enough inconsistency to ask sharper questions. Then a vendor called me by mistake. He had one of my older email signatures on file and assumed I was still reviewing payment flows for one of the development entities. He asked whether delayed remittance on a long-standing invoice was part of the new timing approach Greg had mentioned or whether they needed to consider placing the account on hold. My chest tightened the moment he said new timing approach. That was not an accident. That was language. And language like that spreads only when people have already started justifying strain externally. I asked how long the payments had been slipping. He gave me 3 dates. They lined up perfectly with reporting periods where Linda and Greg had presented confidence most aggressively. That was when the timeline snapped into place. The family dinner was not a random display of arrogance. They were already under pressure. They mocked me because my caution had become dangerous to the myth they still needed everyone else to believe. That realization hit harder than I expected. Because it meant the humiliation was strategic. Not planned like theater, maybe, but useful. And once people find public ridicule useful, you learn something about what they are protecting. I stopped staying quiet after that. Not publicly on social media. Not vindictively. But I documented everything I had, retained copies of my review versions, and met with an attorney I trusted enough to ask a narrow question. What obligation, if any, did I have if my work had been materially used in financial representations that I now believed were selectively polished beyond what the underlying conditions could support? The answer was careful and unsatisfying. It depended on scope, on knowledge, on reliance, on what had been represented and to whom. That ambiguity did not comfort me, but it did force me to act with precision. I sent Linda and Greg one formal email, not emotional, not accusatory, a simple written statement that I was withdrawing from any future reporting or reconciliation assistance, that I did not authorize continued reference to my review role in any current or future lender or investor context, and that prior materials I had touched should not be described as final or endorsed by me without my written confirmation. That email detonated the family. Linda called my mother within 20 minutes. By the time my mother called me, she was already crying, asking why I was turning a misunderstanding into a crisis. That phrase again, misunderstanding. I told her this was not about the dinner anymore. It was about the fact that I had been used to make aggressive reporting look more credible than it deserved. She did not fully understand the mechanics, but she did understand one thing. I was no longer protecting the peace. My father surprised me. He came over that night and asked to see the side-by-side versions of the reports. He read them more carefully than I expected. Then he asked a single question. Did they know this when they mocked you? I said yes. Not every detail, maybe, but enough to know my caution was inconvenient to the story they were selling. He nodded once and said, "Then they weren't laughing at you? They were lowering your value in the room." That sentence was the most accurate thing anyone in my family had said since this began. A week later, one of Linda's development deals stalled. Then another lender delayed approval on a refinancing track that had been described at the family dinner as nearly done. Then one of the properties she kept calling beautifully stabilized was revealed, in market chatter first and documents later, to have occupancy softness deeper than anyone outside the inner circle had been told. That was when the crumble began. Not because I caused it, because the same mindset that made them comfortable using me had already made the structure too dependent on polished confidence to survive when real pressure arrived. Once the first two deals stalled, everything around Linda and Greg changed. Not instantly. That is important. Financial empires do not usually collapse in a cinematic afternoon. They erode in sequence. Confidence thins first. Then financing tightens. Then partners become colder, vendors become firmer, and people who once praised your vision start asking for backup documents instead of drinks. That is when the room turns. The family felt it before they understood it. My mother stopped bragging about Linda's projects to friends because she could not tell which ones were still real in the way she had imagined them. My father grew quieter. My Aunt Melissa, who used to speak about Linda as if success itself had chosen her personally, started calling the situation complicated, which is the family word people use when they need distance from someone they recently admired too loudly. Linda did what ambitious people often do when public certainty becomes harder to maintain. She performed calm more intensely. She kept hosting small dinners. She kept talking about restructuring, repositioning, and strategic patience. She kept dressing like victory was still inevitable. But underneath it, things were shifting fast. One commercial tenant exercised an exit clause earlier than expected. A refinancing that had been quietly assumed as routine became conditional. Then one of Greg's outside investors pushed for a full internal review before releasing further capital on a pending redevelopment phase. That review mattered, because once outside capital demands real clarity, the internal language games stop helping. Timing becomes exposure. Presentation becomes liability. The phrase financial empire had always been ridiculous in one sense, but it felt accurate too, because empires do not only grow on wealth. They grow on belief. And the moment belief weakens, skill becomes vulnerability. Linda called me once during that period, not to apologize, to ask whether I had spoken to anyone outside the family about the reports. That was the first question. Not how are you? Not I went too far. Not I need to explain. Only whether the walls were still holding. I told her I had protected myself appropriately and that beyond that, she should be far more concerned with the documents she had already sent into the world than with me. She grew sharp immediately. She said I was enjoying this. That accusation did not hurt the way she expected it to. By then, I understood that people who build their lives by using others can only imagine exposure as revenge. They cannot imagine that some people simply stop cooperating with distortion and let consequence move on its own. I told her I was not enjoying it. I was just no longer carrying her comfort at the expense of my own integrity. She hung up after that. The real break in the family came 2 weeks later at my parents' house. Linda showed up unannounced. So did Greg. They came in carrying tension like heat. No greeting. No pleasantries. My mother looked terrified before anyone spoke. My father looked annoyed in the quiet way men do when they already know a conversation is about to expose things that should have been faced months earlier. Linda accused me of overreacting to one ugly joke and turning private family irritation into a professional crisis. Greg said my email had destabilized external trust at the worst possible moment. They both spoke as if the central harm in the situation was that I had stopped making their narrative easier. I let them talk. Then I asked one question. If everything was as strong and legitimate as you said, why was my caution such a threat to your room in the first place? Silence. That silence did more than shouting could have. Because the truth was standing in the room now, and no one could move around it cleanly anymore. Greg tried to answer by talking about lender psychology and timing. Linda said sophisticated finance always looks uglier from the inside than from the outside. My father interrupted for the first time. He said, "You used him to make weak things look stronger." That sentence landed heavily because it came from him. Not from me, the overcautious one. Not from my mother, who could be dismissed as emotional. From the man who had spent years admiring their success and now finally saw the moral structure beneath it. Linda burst into tears after that. Real tears. Not performative. Not entirely. But tears do not automatically mean accountability. Sometimes they mean the story a person lives inside has become too unstable to keep performing without help. She said she never meant to hurt me. She said the dinner joke had gone too far because everyone was tense and trying to make the room feel easy. She said they only ever needed my help because they trusted my mind. That last sentence almost made me laugh. Trusted my mind. Not enough to respect it in public. Not enough to heed it when it interfered with profit. Only enough to borrow its credibility while mocking its caution. Exposed stories media exists because this dynamic is more common than families admit. The humiliation is almost never about humor alone. It is about hierarchy. A room chooses who will be taken seriously and who will be lowered into usefulness. And once that hierarchy is publicly fixed, the people at the top feel safer ignoring what they already know. After that confrontation, things moved quickly. One of Greg's investors filed for access to additional internal reporting and delayed a capital release. A lender pushed for revised reserve requirements. Cash movement between properties that had once looked clever suddenly looked exposed. Projects slowed, then stopped. Then a legal review was initiated around whether certain lender-facing representations around asset stabilization had been materially too optimistic. I am choosing that language carefully, because the truth, even now, is not that they ran a cartoon villain empire built entirely on fraud. The truth is more realistic and, in a way, more dangerous. They built something real. Then they let confidence outrun discipline. Then they used people like me to make the gap feel respectable. And when pressure came, they protected the performance longer than the structure could bear. That is how financial empires crumble in the real world. Not always through one spectacular lie, often through 1,000 selective softenings of truth. Within 6 months, the portfolio had contracted significantly. Not all the way to ruin. That would have been cleaner. Instead, it entered the more humiliating phase of visible weakness. Assets sold under pressure. Deals quietly restructured. Relationships damaged but not publicly annihilated. The kind of decline that leaves everyone involved alive enough to remember how admired they used to be. My relationship with Linda never recovered. Not because I wanted punishment. Because I could never again mistake her use of me for respect. That distinction changes everything. My mother tried for a long time to restore some version of family peace. She said people do bad things when they are afraid. She said money pressure can distort judgment. She said blood should matter more than business. But the problem was never only business. It was that when pressure arrived, Linda and Greg did not merely make desperate choices. They chose to lower me publicly because truth told in my voice was dangerous to their image. Some relationships do not break in the moment of betrayal. They break when you finally understand the purpose behind it. My father changed more than anyone. He became harder on appearance after that. Less impressed by polished success. More suspicious of anyone who wanted admiration faster than they wanted scrutiny. Once, months later, he said something that stayed with me. He said, "Money doesn't ruin character. It reveals what people are willing to hide behind." That was exactly right. Linda and Greg did not become exploitative because pressure arrived. Pressure only showed how comfortable they already were using someone else's integrity to keep their own story polished. If there is one lesson in this story, it is not simply that they took advantage of me and then their financial empire started crumbling. It is that exploitation and collapse often grow from the same root. The belief that some people are there to carry risk, absorb discomfort, protect appearances, and stay useful while others get to be celebrated. That belief works for a while, until the structure built on it starts taking pressure. Then it fails exactly where it was always weak. Today, Linda still has money. That matters because people like simple endings, and this one is not simple. She did not lose everything in one dramatic courtroom moment. She lost trust, scale, credibility, and the illusion that everyone around her still believed the myth. Sometimes that is the more enduring loss. She built an image. I helped protect it without understanding the cost. Then I stepped back, and the parts that depended on distortion began revealing themselves. That is not revenge. It is architecture. If this story stayed with you, that may be why exposed stories media matters. Not because business collapses are thrilling, because collapse often reveals what success had been hiding, and because the people who get laughed at, diminished, or called too cautious in wealthy rooms are often the only ones still trying to protect reality before it gets expensive. So if someone keeps praising your loyalty while quietly making you useful in ways that never fully benefit you, pay attention. If your honesty is welcome in private but mocked in public, pay closer attention. And if a room full of successful people treats your caution like an inconvenience, ask yourself one hard question. What truth are they already afraid your voice might make too visible to ignore?